My father-in-law tapped his crystal champagne flute, smiling as he publicly thanked my husband for rescuing me from the hood. The ballroom of 300 elites erupted in laughter. My husband just stood there sipping his bourbon and nodding. But when I stepped up to the microphone and revealed the humiliating financial secret I had been keeping for his family, the laughter stopped dead. And my husband made the biggest mistake of his life by raising his hand to me in front of everyone. What he did not know was that with one single phone call, his entire privileged world was about to be legally and ruthlessly dismantled. I am Kendra, 35 years old, and before I continue this story of absolute betrayal and ultimate revenge, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you believe that no woman should ever tolerate disrespect from her in-laws. It was supposed to be a celebration. Our 5th wedding anniversary at the Oak Ridge Country Club in Atlanta. The massive ballroom was dripping in wealth. Crystal chandeliers cast a golden glow over tables covered in imported white silk linens. 300 of Atlanta's most influential socialites, politicians, and corporate titans mingled drinking vintage champagne. I stood near the head table wearing a custom emerald gown I had bought myself, feeling completely isolated. For 5 years I had played the perfect supportive wife to Julian. His family came from old Southern money. They were the kind of people who measured your worth by your pedigree and your last name. I had introduced myself simply as Kendra Washington when Julian and I met. I never mentioned that Washington was my late mother's maiden name, or who my father really was. I wanted to be loved for me, not my connections. Julian's father, Elias, was the patriarch. He owned a commercial real estate empire and ruled his family with an iron fist. He never liked me. He made it obvious at every Sunday dinner, every holiday, and especially tonight. Elias tapped his knife against his glass, demanding the room's attention. The live orchestra stopped playing. Everyone turned toward the grand stage where Elias stood looking distinguished in his tailored tuxedo. He started his toast by talking about family legacy and the importance of bloodlines. But instead of honoring Julian and me on our anniversary, he immediately shifted his focus to my brother-in-law Terrence and his wife Chloe. Chloe was white, came from a wealthy political family in Savannah, and possessed a profound sense of entitlement. She sat at the front table adjusting her diamond necklace and smirking at the crowd. Elias raised his glass directly to her, praising her exceptional breeding, her class, and how perfectly she fit into their elite world. He called her the crown jewel of the family. Then Elias turned his cold gaze to me. His smile did not reach his eyes. He gripped the microphone tightly, and his voice echoed through the massive ballroom. "And then there is our Kendra," he said, his tone dripping with heavy condescension. We all know Kendra came from very humble, scrappy roots. She did not have the advantages of a proper upbringing or a notable family name. In fact, we often joke that she was basically raised by the streets. But Julian, my brilliant son, saw a charity case worth saving. He rescued her from the struggle and gave her a beautiful life she could have only dreamed of. Let us applaud Julian for his generous heart. A collective chuckle rippled through the crowd. 300 wealthy elites were laughing at my expense. The humiliation burned hot in my chest. My hands trembled slightly as I looked at my husband, expecting him to intervene. I expected him to step up and defend the woman he vowed to protect and cherish. But Julian just stood there, leaning casually against the private bar, holding his glass of expensive bourbon. He took a slow sip and actually nodded in agreement with his father. He was enjoying the power trip. He loved the false narrative that he was my savior. In that exact moment, the illusion of my marriage shattered completely. 5 years of biting my tongue, trying to earn the approval of people who saw me as beneath them, simply vanished into thin air. I did not feel like crying. I felt a cold, absolute clarity. The woman Julian thought he married, the helpless, grateful orphan, was dead. I looked at Elias, who was basking in the applause of his wealthy peers. Then I looked at Chloe, who was whispering something to Terrence behind her hand, clearly mocking me. They thought I was defenseless. They thought I was weak. They had no idea who they were dealing with. I smoothed down the front of my gown and took a deep breath. I caught the eye of the head waiter and gave a slight commanding nod. I walked deliberately toward the stage. My heels clicked rhythmically against the polished marble floor, cutting through the fading applause. I walked right up the stairs and stood next to Elias. Before he could react or pull away, I calmly took the microphone straight from his hand. The room fell into a confused, hushed silence. I smiled brightly, looking out at the sea of expectant faces. "Thank you, Elias, for that breathtakingly honest toast," I began, my voice steady and clear, echoing across the room. "It truly is a blessing to be part of a family that values transparency." Speaking of transparency, I have a quick question for the club manager. I spotted Mr. Sterling, the general manager, standing nervously near the grand entrance. "Mr. Sterling," I called out, projecting my voice so every single guest could hear every word. "Could you please confirm that my private business account wire transfer of $150,000 cleared this afternoon? I just wanted to make absolutely sure I covered my father-in-law's severely delinquent membership dues. I would hate for your security team to drag him out of his own son's anniversary party for non-payment." The silence that followed was deafening. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating quiet where you could hear a pin drop. Chloe's smug smile vanished instantly, replaced by sheer panic. Terrence choked on his drink, spilling it down his expensive suit. The wealthy socialites stared at Elias in absolute shock, murmuring rapidly to one another. The carefully crafted facade of the untouchable billionaire patriarch cracked wide open for everyone to see. Elias turned a deep, violent shade of purple. His hands shook uncontrollably as he stared at me, his eyes wide with pure, unadulterated hatred. I had just exposed him to his elite peers as a complete fraud living on borrowed money and my silent charity. The gasp that ripped through the ballroom was collective and deafening. It was the sound of 300 high society illusions shattering all at once. Women in designer gowns covered their mouths, and men in tailored tuxedos shifted uncomfortably, side-eyeing Elias. The invincible patriarch of the family, the man who had just stood on stage lecturing everyone about legacy and superiority, was visibly trembling. The color drained from his face and then surged back in a violent mottled shade of purple. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. The microphone in my hand felt like a weapon, and I had just fired the opening shot. Before I could hand the microphone back to the frozen club manager, heavy footsteps pounded up the wooden stairs of the stage. It was Julian, my husband, the man who had promised to protect me. His face was twisted into a mask of pure rage. He did not look like the polished, sophisticated gentleman Atlanta society adored. He looked like a cornered animal. He lunged forward and his fingers clamped down on my bare upper arm like a vice. His grip was punishingly tight, digging into my skin. I did not flinch, but I stared directly into his eyes. In that brief second, I saw exactly who Julian was. He was not furious because I had lied. He was furious because I had stripped away his power and exposed his family as the financial frauds they truly were. "You have lost your mind," he hissed, his voice a venomous whisper that the front row could definitely hear. "Let go of me, Julian," I said, my voice perfectly level and steady. Instead of releasing me, he yanked me toward him. And then the unthinkable happened. Julian raised his free hand and brought it across my face with a sickeningly loud crack. The slap echoed through the silent ballroom, bouncing off the crystal chandeliers and the vaulted ceilings. The force of it snapped my head to the side and sent a blinding flash of white-hot pain shooting through my left cheek. For a moment, the entire world stopped spinning. The music, the whispers, the breathing of 300 people simply ceased to exist. I stood frozen on the stage, my cheek burning, absorbing the reality of what my husband had just done. Down at the front table, slicing through the horrified silence, came a sound that made my blood run entirely cold. It was a laugh, a sharp, audible snicker. I shifted my gaze downward and saw Chloe covering her mouth with her hand, her eyes dancing with malicious delight. She was enjoying watching the black woman she despised get violently put in her place. Julian leaned in so close I could smell the expensive bourbon on his breath. "You are nothing but trash." He spat, his words dripping with pure hatred. You embarrassed my father. You humiliated this family. You are going to get down on your knees right now, apologize to him, and beg for our forgiveness in front of everyone. Or I swear to you, Kendra, I will leave you with absolutely nothing." He released my arm, expecting me to crumble. He expected the quiet, obedient wife to break down in tears to apologize and submit to his authority. But as I stood there feeling the sharp metallic taste of blood pooling on my lower lip, something inside me shifted forever. The fear completely vanished. The desire to belong to this toxic family evaporated. I tasted the copper, wiped the small drop of blood from my mouth with the back of my hand, and stood up perfectly straight. I did not cry. I did not scream. I looked at Julian with a terrifying absolute calm that made him involuntarily take a step back. "You could never leave me with nothing, Julian," I said, my voice low but carrying a weight he had never heard before. "Because you never had anything to give me in the first place." I reached down to my left hand. Slowly and deliberately, I slid the 5-carat diamond engagement ring and the platinum wedding band off my finger. They felt heavy, like shackles I was finally unlocking. Julian watched me, his chest heaving, his anger slowly giving way to confusion. I walked down the short flight of stairs, descending gracefully from the stage. Julian had left his half-full champagne glass resting on the edge of the front table, right next to where Chloe and Terrence were sitting. I stopped at the table. Chloe stopped snickering, looking at me with nervous hesitation. I held my hand over Julian's crystal glass and let go. The heavy diamond rings dropped into the champagne with a sharp, definitive clink that seemed to ring in the ears of every single person in the room. The bubbles hissed and rose to the surface, swirling around the symbol of a dead marriage. I turned my back on my husband, my father-in-law, and the entire room full of judgmental hypocrites. I kept my shoulders pulled back and my head held high. I walked straight down the center aisle of the ballroom. Nobody said a word. Nobody moved to stop me. The crowd simply parted like the Red Sea, allowing me to pass through their stunned silence. I could feel hundreds of eyes burning into my back, but I did not rush. I walked with the steady, measured pace of a woman who was walking out of a prison she had built for herself. I pushed through the heavy oak double doors and stepped out into the crisp, cool Atlanta night air. The valet immediately noticed my presence and hurried to retrieve my car, sensing the tension radiating from me. I wrapped my arms around myself, fighting the sudden adrenaline crash, but my mind was operating with laser precision. I pulled my phone out of my evening bag. I opened my contacts and scrolled past my business associates, my PR clients, and the false friends I had made in Julian's world. I stopped at a number saved simply as JR. My thumb hovered over the screen. It was a private, secure line, a number I had not dialed in exactly 10 years. 10 years ago, I had walked away from his empire, determined to build my own life without living in his massive shadow. I wanted to prove I could succeed without his money and without his terrifying reputation. But tonight the rules had completely changed. Julian and Elias thought they could destroy me because they thought I was alone. They thought I was a helpless orphan they could discard and abuse. They were wrong. I pressed call and pressed the phone to my ear. It rang only twice before the line clicked open. There was no greeting on the other end, just the steady breathing of a man who commanded boardrooms and dismantled corporations for sport. "Dad," I said, my voice cracking for the very first time that night. "I need you." There was a heavy pause on the line before a deep, resonant voice answered. A voice that carried the weight of absolute, terrifying authority. "I am here, Kendra," he said. "Tell me who I need to destroy." I put my phone back in my evening bag and handed my ticket to the valet. I tipped him $100 bill from my emergency cash and slid into the leather driver's seat of my car. The drive from the Oak Ridge Country Club to the upscale neighborhood of Buckhead, where Julian and I lived, was usually a blurry 30-minute commute. Tonight, every streetlight and intersection felt incredibly sharp. My mind was no longer clouded by the obligations of being a quiet, supportive wife. I was a strategist now. I was my father's daughter. I pulled into the wide driveway of our luxury townhouse. The massive three-story brick building stood quietly in the dark, surrounded by perfectly manicured hedges. Julian loved parading this house to his friends. He loved telling them how hard he worked to provide such a beautiful home for his underprivileged wife. The truth was, Julian had terrible credit when we met. I had to jump through burning hoops just to secure the original mortgage, but I let him take the credit because I wanted to build his ego. I wanted him to feel like the powerful man of the house. That was my first mistake, and I was about to correct it. Before I could even turn off the engine, my phone began to vibrate violently in the cup holder. It was a relentless, continuous buzzing that echoed in the quiet cabin of my car. I picked it up and saw dozens of missed calls from Julian and Elias. Then the text messages started pouring in rapidly. I opened the main thread from Julian. It read, "I froze the joint bank accounts, Kendra. Every single one of them. I also disabled your access code to the front door. You are locked out. You have absolutely nothing without me. Good luck paying for a hotel on your own. Do not bother coming back here." Right beneath Julian's message, a new notification popped up on the screen. It was from Chloe. She could not resist the urge to kick me while she thought I was down. Her message read, "Julian told us what he did. Terrence and I are coming over first thing tomorrow morning to start moving our things into the master bedroom. Julian said we can have the house since you will not be needing it anymore. Go find a homeless shelter, sweetie." I sat there in the driver's seat, bathed in the soft blue glow of the dashboard lights, and I actually smiled. It was a genuine, relaxed smile. They were so incredibly predictable. They operated on the arrogant assumption that because I never flaunted my wealth, I simply did not have any. Julian thought that freezing a shared account with a few $1,000s in it would somehow break my spirit and leave me destitute. He forgot, or simply never realized, that the woman he married ran one of the most successful crisis public relations firms in the entire state. I dealt with corporate blackmailers, ruthless politicians, and hostile takeovers for a living. His petty financial threats were amateur child's play. I reached over to the passenger seat and unzipped my leather briefcase. I pulled out my laptop and rested it on the steering wheel. I connected to my secure mobile hotspot and logged into my firm's encrypted server. I bypassed the standard security protocols and entered my private administrative dashboard. My fingers flew across the keyboard, pulling up a hidden encrypted folder labeled Personal Assets. Inside that folder was every piece of financial documentation I had meticulously managed since the day Julian and I got married. I had loved him, yes, but I was never stupid. I scrolled down the list of files and found exactly what I was looking for. It was a digital copy of the original property deed and the subsequent transfer of ownership documents. 2 years ago, when Elias convinced Julian to invest heavily in a failing commercial real estate venture, Julian needed capital fast. He begged me to leverage the equity in our home to save him from bankruptcy. Instead, I quietly paid off the remaining mortgage balance using my own business accounts and transferred the entire property title into a holding company, a limited liability company that I owned entirely. Julian was so desperate for the cash injection that he never read the paperwork properly. He just signed where I told him to sign, saw that his debt was cleared, and went back to playing golf with his elite friends. I downloaded the legal document and converted it into a clean, easily readable PDF file. I picked up my phone and created a new group text message, including both Julian and Chloe. I did not write a long, emotional paragraph. I did not plead or argue or try to justify myself. I simply attached the PDF file of the deed and typed a single sentence. "I think you should read the name on the deed before you start picking out new curtains, Chloe." I hit send and watched the little green progress bar shoot across the screen. I knew exactly what was happening on the other end. I could vividly picture Julian standing in the country club parking lot, angrily opening the attachment on his screen. I could see Chloe's smug face dropping completely as she zoomed in on the legal text. There it was in stark black and white. The property was not owned by Julian. It was not marital property, subject to division in a divorce. It was the sole corporate asset of Apex Public Relations, LLC. My company. I did not wait for their replies. I put my car in park and grabbed my bags. Julian thought he had locked me out of the house, but he did not know that the smart home security system was entirely registered under my corporate email address and tied to my private server. I opened the security app on my phone, tapped a few buttons, and bypassed the main hub entirely. I reset the master access codes, locking Julian out of the system completely. I stepped out of my car, walked up the front steps, and keyed in my new customized code. The heavy metal deadbolt clicked open smoothly, echoing in the quiet night. I stepped inside my house, closed the heavy oak door behind me, and prepared for the midnight eviction. I stood in the grand foyer of my townhouse, taking a deep breath of the quiet air. 10 minutes had barely passed since I hit send on that text message when the silent flash of headlights swept across the front windows. I walked to the glass double doors and looked out into the night. 3 matte black Cadillac Escalades were gliding smoothly up my long cobblestone driveway, moving with quiet military precision. They parked in perfect unison, blocking the entrance entirely. The doors opened simultaneously, and 6 towering men stepped out into the humid Atlanta night. They were dressed in impeccably tailored dark suits. These were not regular movers or standard security guards. They were my father's personal fixers. Men who handled corporate espionage, high-level asset recovery, and physical extractions without ever leaving a trace. The lead man, a broad-shouldered gentleman named Carter, walked up the stone steps. I opened the door before he could even raise his hand to knock. "Good evening, Miss Washington Carter," said his voice, a low, respectful rumble. "Mr. Richards sent us to assist with your spring cleaning. He said you needed some heavy lifting done immediately, and that we were to follow your instructions to the letter." I smiled, stepping aside to let them in. "Thank you, Carter. I appreciate the fast response. The master bedroom walk and closet, the guest room dressers, and the basement golf simulator room. I want every single item belonging to my husband packed up and removed from the premises tonight." Carter nodded to his team. 2 of them unrolled thick bundles of heavy-duty industrial black trash bags. They did not bring cardboard moving boxes. They did not bring carefully lined garment bags or protective bubble wrap. They brought contractor-grade garbage bags meant for hauling away demolition debris. They moved through my house with breathtaking efficiency. I stood in the doorway of the master suite, leaning against the frame, watching as Julian's prized possessions were unceremoniously swept off the custom shelving. Julian loved his expensive toys. He bought them all using the credit lines I quietly paid down every single month. I watched without a shred of pity as the men grabbed handfuls of his custom-tailored Italian silk suits, ripping them from their cedar hangers and stuffing them aggressively into the thick plastic bags. His collection of vintage watches, the ones he loved flashing at the country club to impress Elias, went into a plastic grocery sack before being tossed in with the shoes. Down in the basement, I could hear the loud clatter of his limited edition titanium golf clubs being thrown together like cheap scrap metal. It was incredible to realize how much space one arrogant man could take up in a home he did not even own. Within 45 minutes, the men had completely sterilized the house of Julian's existence. Every pair of imported leather shoes, every bottle of ridiculously overpriced cologne, every cashmere sweater was bagged and tied tightly at the top with thick plastic knots. Carter and his men hauled the heavy bags out the front door one by one, carrying them down the long driveway. They did not load them into the trunks of the Escalades. Following my exact instructions, they dragged the heavy black bags all the way down to the edge of the street right next to the municipal storm drain. They piled them high on the concrete curb, making a massive mountain of black plastic. Just as the final bag containing Julian's golf clubs was dropped onto the pavement, a low rumble of thunder echoed across the dark Atlanta skyline. A heavy, sudden summer rainstorm broke open, pouring absolute buckets of water onto the city streets. I stood on my covered porch watching the relentless rain soak the garbage bags containing my husband's precious, fragile ego. I knew the seals on those bags were not entirely waterproof. By morning, his expensive Italian leather shoes and silk ties would be soaking in muddy street water. It was the most beautiful weather I had seen in 5 years. Carter walked up the front steps, wiping the heavy rain from his face. "Is there anything else you need handled tonight, Miss Washington?" he asked, respectfully, keeping his posture rigid. "No, Carter. This is absolutely perfect," I replied, crossing my arms to stay warm in the cool breeze. "Please tell my father I will see him tomorrow afternoon at the downtown office." Carter bowed his head slightly. The men returned to their vehicles and the Escalades reversed out of the driveway, melting back into the dark, stormy night as quickly as they had appeared. I walked back inside the house and locked the heavy oak door behind me. I pulled out my phone and accessed the central hub for the smart home system. I went straight into the administrative settings and permanently deleted Julian's biometric data from the front door keypad. I changed the master passcode, locking out his mobile app access and severing his connection to the security cameras. Then I activated the perimeter laser alarm and the high-definition exterior cameras to record the driveway. The house was now an impenetrable fortress, and I was the only one holding the keys. I walked into the massive gourmet kitchen, turning on only the soft under-cabinet lights. I opened the custom wine fridge and pulled out a bottle of vintage Pinot Noir. It was a rare bottle gifted by one of my corporate clients that Julian always complained was far too expensive to open without a special occasion. I figured taking out the trash was a perfect occasion. I grabbed a crystal glass, pulled the cork, and poured myself a generous serving. I walked into the dark living room and sat down in the plush velvet armchair, right by the large front window. Outside, the rain continued to hammer down violently on the mountain of trash bags piled on the curb. Inside the house was completely silent, peaceful, and entirely mine for the first time in 5 years. I took a slow, deliberate sip of the dark red wine, letting the rich, complex flavor settle on my tongue. I did not feel an ounce of regret or sadness. I felt an incredible surging wave of pure power. Julian, Terrence, and Chloe thought they had won tonight. They thought they had successfully humiliated the poor, defenseless orphan in front of all their wealthy friends and driven her out of their pristine, elite lives forever. They were probably toasting to my demise right now, at some exclusive after-party completely oblivious to the legal and financial avalanche I had just triggered. They thought tomorrow morning was going to be the start of their glorious new chapter, moving into my house, taking over my master bedroom, and asserting their absolute dominance. I rested my crystal glass on the side table and leaned back deep into the velvet chair, keeping my eyes firmly locked on the wet driveway illuminated by the flickering street lamps. "Let them come," I whispered into the quiet, empty room. "Let them try to take what is mine." The morning was going to be explosive, and I had a front-row seat to the absolute destruction of my husband's grand illusion. The morning sun broke through the heavy gray clouds, casting a harsh, unforgiving light over the wet pavement of my driveway. I had been awake for hours. I showered, styled my hair, and dressed in a perfectly tailored crimson pantsuit. I was not going to meet my enemies looking like a heartbroken victim. I treated this morning exactly like I treated a hostile corporate takeover at my public relations firm. I brewed a cup of black espresso, sat at my kitchen island, and watched the live feed from my exterior security cameras on my tablet. Right on schedule at exactly 7 o'clock, a pristine white Range Rover turned onto my property. I watched the screen intently as Julian, Terrence, and Chloe stepped out of the vehicle. They were laughing, holding premium coffees from a boutique cafe downtown. They looked incredibly smug, clearly expecting to walk right through my front door and claim my home as their new prize. Chloe was already pointing at the large bay windows of the master bedroom, likely telling Terrence how she planned to redecorate my sanctuary. Then she stopped. Chloe was the first to notice the massive pile of black contractor bags sitting down by the storm drain. She pointed them out with a perfectly manicured finger, a look of disgust crossing her face. Julian frowned and marched aggressively over to the curb. I watched as he grabbed the top of the nearest bag and ripped the plastic open. A soggy, ruined sleeve of his custom Tom Ford tuxedo spilled out onto the wet concrete. The arrogant smile he had worn seconds ago vanished instantly, replaced by pure, unadulterated panic. Julian scrambled to open another bag, pulling out his expensive leather loafers now heavy and bloated with murky rainwater. He dug frantically into a third bag, finding his collection of designer watches sitting in a pool of muddy runoff. He dropped the bag, stepping back as if he had been physically struck. The reality of his situation was finally sinking in. Julian sprinted up the cobblestone walkway and aggressively punched his access code into the front door keypad. A harsh red light blinked back at him, accompanied by a loud error buzz. He tried again, hammering his fingers against the numbers. Nothing happened. He began pounding his fists against the heavy oak door, screaming my name. "Open this door, Kendra!" he yelled, his voice cracking with rage. "Open this door right now! You are crazy!" When I did not answer, he pulled out his phone, pacing frantically on my front porch. Through the audio feed on the camera, I heard him dial 911. "Yes, I need the police immediately," he shouted into the receiver, his face red with fury. "My deranged wife has locked me out of my own house. She destroyed thousands of dollars of my property, and she is aggressively trespassing. Send officers right now, she is completely out of control." 15 minutes later, the flashing blue and red lights of an Atlanta Police Department cruiser illuminated my front yard. Two uniformed officers stepped out of the vehicle looking tense and prepared for a volatile domestic dispute. Julian immediately rushed toward them, waving his arms wildly, playing the role of the outraged, traumatized homeowner. "Officer, thank God you are here," he pleaded, pointing a shaking finger at my front door. "She has completely lost her mind. She threw all my belongings into the street and locked me out." But before Julian could finish spinning his web of lies, Chloe pushed her way to the front of the group. She knew exactly how to play this game, and she activated her ultimate weapon. The tears came instantly, real heavy tears streaming down her pale cheeks. She clutched Terrence by the arm, shrinking back behind him as if she were in imminent mortal danger. "Officers, please, you have to help us!" Chloe cried, her voice trembling perfectly to convey absolute terror. "She is so aggressive and completely unhinged. Last night, she caused a massive scene at a high-society public event, and she physically attacked my brother-in-law. We are terrified of what she might do next. She broke into the house, changed the locks, and is holding it hostage. She is a very angry, dangerous woman." Chloe was deliberately weaponizing her tears, using every toxic racial stereotype available to paint me as the angry, violent black woman terrorizing the innocent, fragile white sister-in-law. The older officer placed his hand resting near his duty belt, looking gravely concerned by Chloe's theatrical performance. They were buying the narrative. I decided they had enjoyed enough stage time. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the heavy oak door open, stepping out onto the porch. I did not look frantic. I did not raise my voice. I looked like a wealthy woman who commanded authority for a living. "Good morning, officers," I said, my voice incredibly calm and steady, cutting straight through Chloe's fake sobbing. "I am Kendra Washington, the sole legal owner of this property. I assume these people called you under the completely false pretense of a domestic disturbance." Julian scoffed, stepping forward aggressively. "Do not listen to her. She is lying. Tell her to get out of my house right now." I did not even look at Julian. I simply walked down the steps and handed a crisp manila folder to the older officer. "Inside that folder, you will find the certified property deed registered exclusively to Apex Public Relations, LLC, which I own in its entirety," I explained, keeping my tone strictly professional. "You will also find a notarized post-nuptial addendum signed by that man Julian, right there, acknowledging that he waived all residency rights and claims to this address 2 years ago in exchange for me bailing him out of massive financial debt. He has absolutely no legal claim to this property." The officer opened the folder and slowly scanned the legal documents. His eyes moved carefully from the embossed state seals to the undeniable signatures at the bottom of the page. The tension in his shoulders dropped immediately. He realized he was not dealing with a crazed squatter, but a highly organized corporate executive. He closed the folder, handed it back to me with a respectful nod, and turned around to face Julian. The officer's expression was now cold and intensely irritated. "Sir," This is a civil matter, and according to these certified documents, you have zero legal right to be on these premises, the officer said firmly. Julian stammered, his face turning bright red with humiliation. But that is my wife. All my things are out there in the trash. I live here. The officer pointed a stern, commanding finger toward the street. Your marital issues are for a divorce court to decide, sir. Right now, the legal property owner is asking you to leave. If you or your family members do not vacate this driveway and step off this property in the next 60 seconds, I will arrest all three of you for criminal trespassing. Do you understand me? Chloe instantly stopped crying. The tears dried up in a millisecond, and her mouth hung open in absolute shock. Her weapon had completely failed. Terrence grabbed Julian's shoulder, pulling him back toward the white Range Rover, whispering urgently that they needed to leave before they were put in handcuffs. Julian glared at me with a hatred so deep and venomous it could have burned down the house, but he had absolutely no power left. He was completely impotent. He turned on his heel and marched back to the car. As they drove away, leaving his ruined, expensive wardrobe rotting in the muddy gutter, I took a deep breath of the morning air. They had lost the battle for the house, but I knew Elias and Julian were not going to stop here. Driven by pure humiliation, they were about to launch a full-scale war on my reputation, and I was more than ready for it. I watched the white Range Rover disappear down the street and locked the front door. The house was quiet again, but I knew the silence was only temporary. Julian and his family were cowards in person, but they were incredibly vicious when they could hide behind their wealth and their social networks. I walked into my home office, a sleek, brightly lit space with 3 oversized monitors set up across a massive mahogany desk. I sat down in my leather chair, and barely 30 minutes passed before Elias launched his first retaliatory strike. My private office line rang. It was the chief executive officer of a major regional tech startup, one of my anchor public relations clients. When I answered, his voice was tight and incredibly nervous. He did not bother with pleasantries. Kendra, I am so sorry, he stammered. I just received a call from Elias. He told me about this situation last night. He sits on the board of our primary venture capital firm, and he made it very clear that if we continue doing business with your agency, our next round of funding will be indefinitely stalled. We have to terminate your contract effective immediately. Before I could even process the loss of a 6-figure retainer, the phone rang again. This time it was the marketing director of a luxury hotel chain I represented. She sounded equally apologetic but firm. Elias had leveraged his commercial real estate connections to threaten their upcoming lease renewals. They were pulling their account. Within exactly 1 hour, 3 of my top-tier clients, the cornerstone accounts of my entire agency, called to abruptly sever all ties. Elias was executing a classic corporate starvation tactic. He wanted to cut off my cash flow, ruin my professional reputation, and force me into a corner where I would have to beg him for mercy. I leaned back in my chair and took a slow sip of my coffee. I did not panic. I did not desperately dial my clients back to plead with them. I knew that in the world of high-stakes public relations, panicking was the quickest way to lose the war. Elias thought he was destroying my life, but he did not realize my agency was heavily diversified and completely debt-free. Losing 3 clients was a flesh wound, not a fatal blow. Just as I set my coffee mug down, my cell phone chimed with an urgent text from my executive assistant. The message simply read, "You need to look at Instagram right now. Do not respond, just watch." She included a direct link. I clicked the link on my desktop monitor, and the screen instantly populated with a live video feed. It was Chloe. She was broadcasting live to her 50,000 followers who knew her as a wealthy, perfectly curated lifestyle influencer. But this morning, the perfect aesthetic was gone. Chloe was sitting on the edge of a bed wearing an oversized gray sweater with her blonde hair pulled into a messy bun. She had completely scrubbed off her makeup to look pale and fragile. She was clutching a tissue and trembling violently for the camera. "I am literally shaking right now, you guys," Chloe said, her voice cracking with perfectly practiced emotion. I debated even coming on here, but I feel like I have a responsibility to speak my truth and warn people. Last night, my husband and I were physically threatened by my sister-in-law. It was the most terrifying experience of my life. She paused to dab carefully at the corner of her eye, making sure not to cover her face, so her audience could see her tears. Chloe knew exactly what she was doing. She was weaponizing her fragility, tapping into deep-rooted racial biases without ever having to use a single slur. She is completely unhinged, Chloe continued, her voice dropping to a dramatic whisper. She violently attacked my father-in-law at a public charity event, and then she locked my husband out of his own home, destroying thousands of dollars of his property. We tried to go over there this morning to just talk to her peacefully, and she completely lost it. She has this dark, aggressive energy. I honestly thought she was going to hurt me. I am so scared for my family. Please just send prayers. I watched the live viewer count skyrocket. The comments were scrolling by faster than I could read them. Her followers were furious on her behalf. They were typing things like "call the police immediately" and "she belongs in a cage and cancel her business." Chloe had successfully painted herself as the innocent, terrified victim of an angry, aggressive black woman. The digital mob mobilized instantly. Within minutes, my assistant sent another frantic message showing that my business pages were under a coordinated attack. Hundreds of Chloe's followers were flooding my company, Yelp and Google profiles with one-star reviews calling my agency unprofessional, dangerous, and unethical. They were tagging my remaining clients, demanding they drop me. Elias was attacking my bank account, and Chloe was assassinating my character in the court of public opinion. They were throwing everything they had at me, trying to bury me under a mountain of scandal. I sat alone in my office watching the hateful comments roll down the screen. Any other person might have broken down crying. Any other business owner might have issued a frantic public apology or engaged in a messy screaming match online. But I was the owner of a boutique crisis management firm. I dismantled digital mobs and corporate hit pieces for a living. To me, this was not a crisis. This was a chessboard, and they had just aggressively moved their queen, leaving their king entirely exposed. I calmly moved the mouse and clicked the small red X in the corner of the browser, permanently closing Chloe's ridiculous theatrical performance. The noise of the internet vanished, leaving only the quiet hum of my computer tower. I opened a separate, highly encrypted secure drive on my desktop. You do not survive in the upper echelons of Atlanta high society without knowing exactly where the bodies are buried. While Julian thought I was busy picking out throw pillows and planning dinner parties over the last 5 years, I had been quietly paying private investigators to look into the source of his family's immense wealth. I navigated through a series of password-protected folders until I found the one labeled Elias Corporate. I double-clicked the folder. Dozens of scanned documents, financial spreadsheets, offshore bank statements, and highly confidential board meeting minutes populated my screen. This was my hidden arsenal. I had meticulously tracked every shady real estate deal, every defaulted loan, and every desperate financial maneuver Elias had made over the last decade. I knew the exact vulnerabilities in his empire. I opened the most recent financial disclosure report Elias had tried to bury. I scrolled past the inflated asset valuations and went straight to the debt liabilities section. I needed to see exactly how close Elias was to the edge of the cliff before I gave him the final push. The smear campaign they were running against me was a temporary distraction. I was not going to fight them on Instagram or in the review section of a website. I was going to strip them of the one thing that gave them the audacity to attack me in the first place. I was going to take their money. I closed the encrypted folder on my computer, taking a deep breath to steady my racing mind. Just as I began formulating my next strategic move, the heavy glass doors of my agency reception area swung open violently. My executive assistant buzzed my intercom, her voice tight with panic, telling me there was a man in the lobby refusing to leave. Before I could even stand up, the man barged past her desk and pushed his way straight into my private office. He was not just a standard process server. He was accompanied by one of Atlanta's most notoriously aggressive and expensive divorce attorneys. This was a lawyer Julian absolutely could not afford on his own, which meant Elias was personally funding this legal assault to break me down. The attorney wore a smug, condescending smile as he threw a thick stack of legal documents directly onto the center of my mahogany desk. "Consider yourself served, Miss Washington," the attorney said, straightening his tie. "My client is seeking an expedited dissolution of marriage and an equitable distribution of all marital assets." I ignored his arrogant tone and picked up the thick stack of papers. I flipped past the standard boilerplate language and went straight to the list of demands. I had to bite the inside of my cheek to stop myself from laughing out loud. Julian was not just asking for a clean break. He was demanding permanent monthly spousal support to maintain the luxury lifestyle he had grown accustomed to. Worse, he was formally petitioning the court for 70% ownership of my public relations firm. His legal justification was a laughable claim that his emotional support and high society networking connections were the sole reason my business had achieved any level of financial success. He even had the absolute audacity to demand that I pay his legal fees for the divorce. Julian truly believed that because my bank accounts were currently frozen and my clients were dropping me, I was desperate and vulnerable. He thought handing me these papers would force me to settle and surrender my company just to make the nightmare stop. I looked up at the attorney who was watching me closely, expecting tears or a panicked outburst. "You can tell Julian that his creative writing skills have significantly improved," I said, tossing the documents back onto my desk. "Now please show yourself out before I have building security physically remove you for trespassing." The attorney sneered, but turned and walked out, leaving the threat lingering in the air. The paperwork was a minor annoyance, but it was also a ticking clock. They were moving aggressively, and I needed to escalate my timeline. I grabbed my designer coat, locked my office, and took the private elevator down to the underground parking garage. I navigated my car through the heavy afternoon traffic, driving deep into the financial district of downtown Atlanta. I pulled up to a towering skyscraper made entirely of dark-tinted glass and black steel. Unlike the other corporate buildings surrounding it, this tower did not have a massive logo on the exterior. It did not need one. The people who belonged inside knew exactly where they were, and the people who did not belong were never invited. The heavily armed security detail in the underground private garage recognized my face instantly. I did not have to show an identification badge. I bypassed the lavish main lobby entirely and stepped into a private express elevator hidden behind a marble partition. The panel required a biometric retinal scan. I leaned in. The machine chimed softly, and the heavy steel doors closed. I shot up 60 floors in complete silence, my stomach dropping slightly from the sheer velocity. When the doors finally slid open, I stepped out into a massive, dimly lit boardroom that occupied the entire top floor of the skyscraper. The walls were floor-to-ceiling glass, offering a breathtaking panoramic view of the entire city. The city I was preparing to conquer. Sitting at the far end of a 30-foot custom mahogany table with his back to the spectacular skyline was Jeremiah Richards, my father. He was a man who moved global markets with a single phone call and dismantled entire corporate industries just because he found them inefficient. He wore a perfectly tailored dark charcoal suit that screamed quiet old money. His face was sharp, unyielding, and carried the intense, terrifying gravity of a man who demanded absolute obedience from everyone he encountered. We stared at each other across the massive expanse of the room. I had not stood in his physical presence since the day I packed my bags at 18 years old. 10 years ago, I legally dropped his famous last name, choosing to take my late mother's maiden name, Washington. I refused his massive trust fund, his elite corporate connections, and his overwhelming influence. I walked away because I wanted to prove I could build my own empire with my own two hands without society whispering that I only succeeded because I was a Richards. He was furious when I left, but he never stopped keeping tabs on me. "You look exactly like your mother, Kendra," he said, his deep, resonant voice filling the quiet, empty room. Coming from him, it was the highest compliment he could possibly give. I walked slowly down the length of the room, taking a leather seat directly across from him. "I assume you already know why I called," I said, keeping my posture completely rigid, refusing to show any intimidation. He leaned forward, intertwining his fingers and resting them on the polished wood. "I know that a mediocre man with a crumbling trust fund laid his hands on my daughter in front of 300 people last night," he replied, his tone dangerously calm. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "I know that his bankrupt father is currently calling your clients and trying to ruin the business you built." Jeremiah did not yell. He did not express emotional outrage or slam his fists on the table. He dealt exclusively in absolute calculated power. "Give me the word, Kendra," he said, his dark eyes locking onto mine. "Give me the word right now, and Julian and his entire pathetic family will not exist in this city by tomorrow morning. I will personally strip Elias of every single property he owns. I will have Julian's bank accounts permanently seized by federal regulators, and I will ensure that blonde girl and her husband are instantly blacklisted from every country club and high society event on the East Coast. I will completely wipe them off the map. It will take me exactly 3 phone calls." It was an incredibly tempting offer. With one single nod of my head, my father would unleash a financial nuclear bomb on the people who had abused, manipulated, and humiliated me. All my problems would vanish instantly. But I took a slow breath and shook my head. "No," I said, my voice firm and unwavering. "If you step in and do this for me, they will just see me as the spoiled rich girl running back to her billionaire daddy for protection. They will think they were right about me all along." Julian slapped me. Chloe mocked me. Elias tried to bankrupt my business. This is my war. I want to dismantle them myself, and I want to do it legally, publicly, and methodically. I want them to know exactly who defeated them. Jeremiah stared at me for a long, heavy moment. The dangerous cold edge in his eyes slowly softened, and the corner of his mouth twitched upward into a genuine, incredibly proud smile. He saw himself in me. He saw the exact same ruthless determination that built his own empire. He reached down beside his leather executive chair and picked up a thick, heavy black folder. He placed it on the mahogany table and slowly slid it across the smooth surface until it stopped directly in front of my hands. "If you truly want to burn their empire down to the foundation, you are going to need the right fuel," he said softly, leaning back into his chair. "Read the dossier. Kendra. Elias has been keeping a very dark, very expensive secret, and he is currently begging a shadow company for a bailout, a shadow company that I happen to own." I placed my hands on the thick black leather cover of the dossier and slowly flipped it open. The boardroom was dead silent, except for the crisp sound of the heavy paper turning. The first page was a comprehensive executive summary of the Elias commercial real estate portfolio. For 5 years, I had watched this man parade around country clubs and high society galas, acting like he was untouchable old money. He treated service workers like garbage and looked down on anyone who did not have a trust fund. But the glaring red numbers on the pages in front of me told a completely different story. Elias was not a king. He was a desperate man drowning in an ocean of toxic debt. I ran my finger down the master ledger. He was $80 million in the red. He had been taking out massive illegal bridge loans to cover catastrophic losses in his retail property investments. When those properties failed to generate revenue, he started commingling investor funds to pay off his personal lines of credit. It was a classic Ponzi scheme structure, and the walls were finally closing in. I turned to the next section and felt a cold smile creep across my face. There were copies of sealed subpoenas from the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Federal Fraud Division. Elias was currently under a covert federal investigation for wire fraud and the misappropriation of corporate funds. According to the internal risk assessment notes, if he did not secure a massive injection of liquid emergency capital by the end of the current month, the federal government was going to freeze his assets publicly, indict him, and send him to federal prison. He is completely ruined, I whispered, staring at the staggering debt column. He is bankrupt, and he knows it. Jeremiah leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers. He has been hiding the bleeding from his investors and his family for 2 years. My father said, his voice smooth and detached. He thought he could outsmart the market. Now he is suffocating, and he is frantically searching for a lifeline. Turn to the final tab in the folder. I flipped a thick stack of financial audits and opened the final section. It was filled with printed copies of desperate, frantic emails and logged phone transcripts. Elias had been reaching out to private equity firms begging for a bailout. Every major bank had already denied him. His last hope was a series of aggressive communications directed at a highly secretive private equity firm, offering them 70% ownership of his entire commercial empire in exchange for a $40 million cash injection just to keep the federal agents off his back. The entity he was begging on his hands and knees was called Apex Investment Group. I stared at the company logo printed at the top of the correspondence. The name hit me like a lightning bolt. Apex Investment Group was not a standard Wall Street firm. It was a ghost. A highly aggressive shadow corporation known in elite financial circles for swallowing failing businesses whole and liquidating their assets for massive profits. Nobody knew who actually sat on the board of directors because the company was buried under layers of offshore holding trusts. But I knew. I looked up from the documents and stared directly at my father. He was watching me with that same knowing, calculated glint in his dark eyes. Apex Investment Group. It was one of his shell corporations. Elias, the man who had just spent the entire morning trying to destroy my public relations firm and bankrupt me to fund his arrogant son's divorce, was literally begging my father for the money to stay out of federal prison. He had absolutely no idea that the phantom billionaires he was pleading with were the exact same family he had just publicly humiliated at the country club. The sheer poetic justice of the situation was intoxicating. Julian thought he was stripping me of my power. Chloe thought she was ruining my reputation on the internet. And all the while their precious patriarch was one signature away from losing everything he had ever built to the very bloodline they despised. He has been blowing up the phone lines of my proxy managers for 3 weeks, Jeremiah said, a slow, dangerous smile finally breaking across his face. My team was preparing to decline his application this morning. I do not invest in failing assets run by incompetent men. But then I received the phone call from you last night. I instructed my managers to keep him on the hook. I wanted to hand you the match to burn his house down. I looked back down at the final email transcript in the folder. Elias sounded pathetic. He was practically crying through the text, promising the Apex proxy managers that his family was built on a legacy of excellence and that this investment would secure their mutual dominance in the Atlanta real estate market. He was selling his soul to save his ego. I closed the thick black dossier with a heavy definitive thud that echoed through the quiet boardroom. I pushed the folder back across the polished mahogany table toward my father. I did not want him to simply deny the loan. Denying the loan would just send Elias to prison quietly, and I was not interested in a quiet victory. They had humiliated me in front of 300 people. They had attacked my character online. I wanted this destruction to be spectacular. I wanted them to feel the exact moment their entire world collapsed. Do not deny his application, I said, my voice dropping to a low, terrifyingly calm pitch. Jeremiah raised a single eyebrow, waiting for my next move. I leaned forward, resting my arms on the table, locking eyes with the most powerful man in the city. Tell your proxy managers to approve the emergency bailout, I continued. Tell them Apex Investment Group is extremely interested in acquiring his commercial real estate portfolio. But I do not want your executives handling the final paperwork. Draft a legally binding corporate mandate right now. Make me the primary proxy director for Apex Investment Group. Transfer the sole signing authority for this acquisition entirely into my name. Jeremiah let out a deep, rumbling laugh that vibrated in the massive room. It was the laugh of a predator watching its offspring finally learn how to hunt. He reached into his suit jacket, pulled out a solid gold fountain pen, and placed it on the table. "Consider it done, Kendra," he said, his eyes shining with absolute pride. "The entire Apex portfolio is at your disposal. How exactly do you want to play this?" I picked up the heavy gold pen, turning it slowly in my fingers. "Elias is hosting a massive press conference and gala next week to announce his spectacular new merger," I replied, visualizing the exact trap I was about to set. "He thinks this shadow company is going to save his legacy and make his family untouchable. Let him believe it. Let him get up on that stage in front of the press, the investors, and his precious high society friends. And when it is time to sign the final contract, I will be the one walking through those doors to close the deal." 2 days had passed since I sat in that glass tower and took absolute control of Apex Investment Group. I did not spend those 48 hours gloating or celebrating prematurely. I spent them working. My public relations agency still needed to thrive, and I had a major acquisition target of my own to secure. I was not going to let Elias and his petty attempts at corporate sabotage slow down my momentum. The annual Magnolia Heights Botanical Gardens Charity Luncheon was the premier networking event for Atlanta's wealthiest philanthropists. It was exactly the kind of hyper-exclusive environment that Julian and his family considered their personal playground. It was a place where old money gathered to drink champagne under massive white floral tents and bid on silent auction items. I arrived early wearing a flawless tailored white silk suit that commanded immediate attention the second I stepped out of my vehicle. I was not there to socialize. I was there to sign a massive international cosmetics brand that was looking to expand into the southern luxury market. The preliminary meeting with their regional director had gone flawlessly. I secured a lucrative contract right there in the garden courtyard, proving to myself that my talent and my business could easily survive without the approval of my former father-in-law. Feeling entirely satisfied with the morning, I walked toward the grand entrance pavilion and stood near the bubbling marble fountain waiting for the valet to bring my car around. That was when I heard the sharp, obnoxious clicking of heels stomping aggressively across the stone courtyard. I turned slowly and saw Chloe marching directly toward me. Terrence was trailing right behind her, walking with that same arrogant swagger he inherited from his father. They had just arrived for the afternoon seating of the luncheon. Chloe was wearing an overly loud pink floral dress and a massive sun hat, clearly trying way too hard to look like Southern royalty. When she spotted me standing near the VIP valet podium, her face contorted into a mask of pure, unfiltered disgust. She marched right up to me, not even bothering to offer a fake social greeting. "Well, look who it is," Chloe announced, her voice deliberately loud and grating. She projected her words specifically to turn the heads of the wealthy guests mingling nearby. "I honestly cannot believe you have the sheer audacity to show your face at a respectable high society event like this, Kendra. Are you here looking for handouts since Julian finally cut off your allowance?" Terrence chuckled, crossing his arms and leaning back on his heels, trying to look physically intimidating. "You really should leave before things get embarrassing for you, Kendra," he added. "My father is about to close the biggest corporate merger in Atlanta history next week. We practically own this city right now. You are absolutely nothing without our family name to protect you." I did not flinch. I did not cross my arms defensively or break eye contact. I simply looked at them as if they were a pair of annoying insects buzzing around my pristine white suit. The sheer irony of Terrence bragging about the Apex Investment Group merger, the very deal I was personally controlling, was almost too delicious to bear. I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing directly in his face. "Did you hear me?" Chloe snapped, taking a step forward and aggressively invading my personal space. "This is a members-only charity coalition. People like you do not just get to walk in here without a wealthy sponsor to vouch for them." She paused, looking me up and down with absolute disdain. "The only reason you were ever allowed into these elite circles was because you were married to a man who had actual class and breeding. Now that Julian has exposed your ghetto aggressive behavior, you are entirely unwelcome here. You are a liability to everyone around you." She practically spat the word ghetto. It was the ultimate racial dog whistle carefully chosen to weaponize her privilege. Chloe was looking around at the older, wealthy white attendees, hoping they would validate her gatekeeping. She wanted to recreate the exact same dynamic from the anniversary party at the country club. She wanted to publicly shame the black woman who dared to occupy the same luxury space as her without bowing her head in gratitude. She was trying to trigger the angry black woman stereotype, hoping I would raise my voice or cause a scene so she could play the terrified victim once again. I am not going to let you ruin this elegant luncheon and terrorize these good people like you did to my father-in-law. Chloe continued, her voice rising in a pitch of fake manufactured panic. I saw the divorce papers Julian served you. I know you are desperate and completely broke. But if you do not turn around and walk your trashy self off this private property right this second, I am going to call the security team and have you forcefully dragged out of here. They do not tolerate aggressive trespassers in Magnolia Heights. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest, planting her feet on the expensive cobblestone. She was waiting for me to lower my eyes and run away in shame. She expected the quiet, obedient 5 years. But I just smiled. It was a cold, dead, predatory smile that completely stripped the manufactured confidence right off Chloe's face. Terrence noticed the shift in my demeanor and physically took a half-step backward, his arrogant smirk faltering. I did not engage in a petty screaming match with her. I did not waste my breath trying to explain my net worth or the success of my public relations agency. I did not even bother telling them that I was currently holding the absolute power of life and death over their entire financial future. Instead, I looked right past Chloe's ridiculous pink sun hat toward the main glass doors of the pavilion. I spotted the head event coordinator. He was a frantic-looking man, wearing a sleek black suit, holding a clipboard, and speaking rapidly into a wireless headset. He was busy directing the catering staff, but I knew exactly who he was. I calmly raised my right hand, keeping my eyes locked dead onto Chloe's pale face, and clearly signaled for the coordinator to come over. The event director noticed my signal immediately. He was a tall, impeccably groomed man, wearing a tailored charcoal suit with a gold name badge that read Preston. He recognized the tension instantly and practically sprinted across the cobblestone courtyard. He arrived slightly out of breath, clutching his clipboard, looking nervously between my pristine white suit and Chloe's loud pink dress. "Is there a problem here, ladies?" Preston asked, his tone dripping with the carefully practiced diplomacy required to handle wealthy, temperamental guests. "Yes, there is a massive problem," Chloe snapped immediately, seizing the opportunity to play her favorite role. She pointed a manicured finger directly at my chest. "This woman is trespassing. She is not a member of the Magnolia Heights Coalition, and she does not have a wealthy sponsor to be here today. She has been aggressively harassing my husband and me ever since we arrived. I want her removed from the premises immediately before she causes a violent scene." Terrence puffed out his chest, standing slightly taller. "You heard my wife, Preston. Get security out here and escort this woman off the property. We are personal guests of Elias, who is a platinum donor. If she is not gone in 2 minutes, I am calling the board of directors and having your job." Preston looked incredibly uncomfortable. He shifted his weight and turned toward me, his eyes filled with professional apology. He clearly recognized Terrence and Chloe from their family money, and he assumed they held the power in this dynamic. "Mom, I am going to have to ask to see your invitation or your membership credentials," Preston said softly. "If you are not on the approved guest list, I must ask you to leave the private gardens." Chloe smiled. It was a vicious, triumphant smile. She thought she had won. She thought she had successfully weaponized the staff against me, just like she weaponized the police the morning after the anniversary party. She folded her arms, waiting for the ultimate satisfaction of watching me do the walk of shame out to the valet. I did not break eye contact with Chloe. I slowly reached into the inside pocket of my silk suit jacket. I did not pull out a paper invitation or a standard guest pass. I slid 2 fingers into my leather card holder and withdrew a solid titanium black card. It was heavy cold and completely devoid of any standard banking logos. The only engraving on the brushed metal was the crest of the parent management group that owned and operated the Magnolia Heights Botanical Gardens, along with dozens of other luxury venues across the state. I held the heavy titanium card out, offering it not to Chloe but to Preston. Preston reached out hesitantly and took the card. As soon as his eyes registered the engraved crest and the serial number beneath it, the color completely drained from his face. His posture instantly snapped from a customer service slouch into rigid military attention. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with sudden absolute terror. For the past 48 hours, I had not just been sitting in my office waiting for Elias to sign his doom. I had been aggressively expanding my own portfolio using the new capital my father had unlocked for me. Magnolia Heights had been struggling with severe operational debt for 3 years. The board of directors had been quietly looking for a buyout to avoid shutting down the historic property. My public relations and holding firm had finalized the acquisition paperwork at 8 o'clock that very morning. Mr. Preston, I said, my voice incredibly calm and projecting clearly across the quiet courtyard. I am Kendra Washington, the Chief Executive Officer of Apex Public Relations and Holdings. As of this morning, my firm is the majority shareholder and the new legal owner of this entire estate, which means I am not a guest at this luncheon. I am your boss. Preston swallowed hard, his hands visibly trembling as he handed the heavy titanium card back to me. Yes, Miss Washington, he stammered, bowing his head slightly. I was notified of the acquisition by the board just an hour ago. I apologize profusely. I did not recognize you. Please let me know how I can be of service to you today. Chloe let out a sharp gasp. Her arms dropped to her sides. She looked at Preston and then at me, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Terrence completely lost his arrogant posture. He took a full step back, nearly tripping over a decorative stone planter. Wait, what are you talking about? Chloe practically shrieked, her carefully curated high society accent completely shattering. That is impossible. She is broke. Her husband just froze her bank accounts. She does not own this place. You are lying. I slipped the titanium card back into my jacket pocket and turned my full attention to the stammering couple in front of me. You really should pay closer attention to the business world, Chloe, I said, smoothing a tiny invisible wrinkle from my silk sleeve. Relying on your father-in-law to fund your entire existence makes you incredibly blind to how real money moves in this city. I turned back to Preston, who was standing at absolute attention, waiting for his first official directive from the new owner. Mr. Preston, I began, keeping my tone light but strictly authoritative. These two individuals are not on my approved guest list. Furthermore, they have been aggressively harassing the owner of the venue. I want them removed from my property immediately. Yes, Miss Washington, right away, Preston replied. He immediately pressed his finger to his wireless earpiece, calling for the heavy security detail. Terrence panicked. You cannot do this, Kendra, he yelled, his voice cracking. My father is going to hear about this. He is going to ruin you. Your father is too busy begging for pocket change to save his own sinking ship, Terrence, I replied coldly. Now you have a choice. You can walk out of here quietly, or my security team can drag you out. 3 massive security guards in dark suits arrived jogging across the courtyard and flanked Preston. They did not look at Terrence or Chloe with any respect. They waited for my nod. I gave it. Remove them, I commanded. And Mr. Preston, do not let them use the front valet exit. I do not want them disturbing the high-paying guests who are enjoying their champagne in the main pavilion. Escort them out through the back service doors, right past the industrial dumpsters and the kitchen staff. Chloe let out a high-pitched scream of absolute horror as 2 of the massive guards stepped forward and firmly grabbed Terrence by his expensive suit jacket. No, you cannot do this to me, Chloe cried out wildly, trying to pull away, as the 3rd guard gestured strictly toward the gravel service path. I am a VIP guest. I am an influencer. Do not touch me. But nobody came to her rescue. The wealthy onlookers who had gathered to watch the drama simply sipped their drinks and whispered among themselves, watching the mighty fall. The guards did not hesitate. They corralled a stuttering, red-faced Terence and a hysterically screaming Chloe away from the beautiful marble fountains and the pristine floral arrangements. I stood quietly on the cobblestone, watching as they were forced down the muddy gravel path designated for garbage removal and catering deliveries. The heavy metal service doors swung open, and the kitchen staff paused their cooking to stare in confusion as the wealthy, arrogant couple was paraded past the greasy stoves and out into the hot, humid alleyway behind the estate. I took a deep breath of the fragrant garden air, feeling the warm sun on my face. The white silk of my suit remained absolutely spotless. I had just taken their favorite playground and turned it into their ultimate humiliation. But as satisfying as it was to watch Chloe and Terence get thrown out with the actual trash, I knew this was only a small appetizer. The main course was coming next week at the press conference, and Elias was about to serve himself up on a silver platter. By the time I returned to my downtown office, the adrenaline from the botanical gardens had settled into a sharp, cold focus. I had successfully humiliated Terence and Chloe and completely stripped them of their social armor, but I knew Julian was the most dangerous piece left on the board. He was dangerous not because he was smart, but because he was a desperate man, backed into a corner with absolutely nothing left to lose. Julian was drowning in a reality he had never prepared for. I had legally frozen all of our joint financial accounts, and his personal credit cards were declining at every luxury establishment across the city. His cutthroat divorce lawyer, the one Elias had hired to intimidate me, required a massive six-figure retainer to actually proceed with the frivolous lawsuit they had filed. But Elias was too busy begging my shadow corporation for his own financial salvation to bail his precious son out of trouble. Julian was completely out of options, and I knew that desperate, arrogant men always make sloppy, fatal mistakes. I knew exactly how Julian's mind worked. When I evicted him from the townhouse and changed the smart locks, I deliberately left a vulnerability. We had an old detached guest house on the property that I previously used as a home office before I expanded my public relations firm. I intentionally left the electronic deadbolt on that specific door disabled. I even left the side window slightly ajar. It was a carefully calculated invitation. I knew that once his aggressive lawyer started demanding immediate payment, Julian would come crawling back to the property, looking for anything of value he could pawn or steal to keep his lawsuit alive. At exactly 4 o'clock in the afternoon, my private cell phone buzzed on my mahogany desk. It was a silent push notification from the hidden closed-circuit security network I had secretly installed in the old home office. The perimeter motion sensors had been breached. I walked over to my office door and locked it, ensuring I would not be disturbed. I poured myself a glass of sparkling water, walked back to my desk, and pulled up the live security feed on my largest desktop monitor. The video quality was absolutely flawless, broadcasting in stunning ultra-high definition. The hidden cameras were equipped with perfectly clear audio, capturing every tiny sound in the room. I leaned back in my leather chair and watched as the heavy wooden door to the home office slowly creaked open. Julian slipped inside, looking frantically over his shoulder. He did not look like the arrogant, polished country club gentleman who had slapped me across the face just a few nights ago. His designer clothes were severely wrinkled, he had not shaved, and he was sweating profusely. His eyes darted around the room with manic energy. He was a rat trapped in a maze, and he was desperately looking for cheese. He immediately began tearing the office apart. He ripped open desk drawers, threw empty file folders onto the floor, and aggressively patted down the bookshelves looking for a hidden safe or a stash of emergency corporate cash. He was completely unhinged, throwing lamps and kicking over chairs when he found nothing. I had cleared out everything of actual value days ago. I removed the electronics, the petty cash, and the sensitive client files. I left him only one single thing to find. In the exact center of my heavy oak desk, sitting perfectly squared on the black leather blotter, was a thick manila folder. It was labeled in bold black letters, Apex Public Relations Corporate Credit Authorization. I watched the screen as Julian finally noticed the folder. He froze. He snatched it up and tore it open, his eyes scanning the documents frantically. I had specifically drafted those dummy documents with my legal team earlier that week. They appeared to be an approved pre-authorized corporate line of credit from a major national bank for exactly $250,000. The paperwork stated that the funds were ready for immediate disbursement. All it required to activate the massive cash injection was my physical signature at the bottom of the final page. I had even left the routing numbers to an old monitored dummy account attached to the file to make it look incredibly authentic. I watched Julian's face on the monitor. I could see the exact moment the gears shifted in his head. The panic melted away and was instantly replaced by a greedy, sinister smile. He pulled his cell phone from his jacket pocket and dialed a number, pacing back and forth across the room. Through the hidden high-definition microphone, I heard the entire conversation perfectly. He was calling his divorce attorney. "Tell the senior partners I have your full retainer," Julian said, his voice trembling with a mixture of manic relief and pure malice. "I just secured a massive line of credit. I will wire the $250,000 to your firm escrow account by tomorrow morning. Just ruin her. I want you to take her business, take the house, and leave her with absolutely nothing." He hung up the phone and let out a shaky breath of triumph. He walked over and sat down in my old desk chair. He was sitting directly in front of a hidden camera I had meticulously concealed inside a decorative digital clock sitting on the desk shelf. The lens was pointed straight at his face and hands. He picked up my favorite silver fountain pen, the one I had conveniently left resting right next to the folder. He grabbed a blank piece of printer paper and began practicing. He pulled an old signed contract of mine out of the trash bin and started trying to perfectly mimic the loops and sharp curves of my handwriting. He spent 10 agonizing minutes carefully tracing my name over and over again, sweating under the pressure of his own crime. He muttered under his breath, cursing me every time he messed up a letter. Finally, he felt confident enough to execute his plan. Julian pulled the official bank credit authorization document toward him. He gripped the silver pen, leaned over the desk, and deliberately forged my legal signature on the bottom line. He pressed down so hard I could see the tendons in his hands straining. He thought he had just completely outsmarted me. He believed he had just stolen $250,000 from my company to fund his legal war against me. He did not realize that by signing a fraudulent financial document intended for a federally insured bank, he had just committed massive felony wire fraud and aggravated identity theft. He grabbed the forged document, stuffed it deeply into his jacket pocket, and hurried out of the office, leaving the door wide open behind him. I sat in my high-rise skyscraper miles away, completely undisturbed. I calmly moved my mouse and clicked stop on the recording software. I had captured the entire felony from the exact moment he broke through the door to the precise second he committed federal fraud. Every bead of sweat, every spoken threat to his lawyer, every single stroke of the silver pen was perfectly preserved. I exported the massive video file from my secure server and saved it directly onto an encrypted titanium flash drive. I pulled the drive from the computer port and felt its cool metal weight in the palm of my hand. Julian had just handed me the absolute perfect kill shot. All I had to do now was wait for Elias to gather the entire city at his precious press conference, and I was going to fire this bullet point blank into the heart of their golden family. I placed the encrypted titanium flash drive inside the hidden wall safe in my private office, locking away the definitive high-definition proof of Julian's felony. For the next 3 days, I completely ignored my phone and watched with deep, quiet amusement as the men who tried to destroy me began loudly digging their own spectacular graves. Elias simply could not keep his mouth shut. He was so desperate to repair his crumbling public image and so intoxicated by the illusion of his impending salvation that he went on a massive media tour before the ink on the Apex contract was even dry. He appeared on every local morning financial news segment in Atlanta, sitting in plush studio chairs, wearing his expensive tailored suits. He bragged endlessly about a historic corporate merger that would supposedly solidify his family's legacy for the next century. He spoke about Apex Investment Group as if they were a group of brilliant Wall Street titans who had personally selected him out of thousands of applicants because of his unparalleled business acumen and visionary leadership. He completely conveniently forgot to mention the $80 million in toxic debt and the looming federal fraud indictment that had forced him into this desperate corner. It was a masterclass in absolute delusion. The rest of his family happily followed his arrogant lead. Chloe, of course, could not resist the opportunity to flaunt wealth that did not even belong to her yet. She went back on Instagram Live, entirely abandoning the terrified, fragile victim persona she had used to try and ruin my business just days earlier. Now she was broadcasting from the passenger seat of a brand new luxury sports car that Terrence had clearly just leased on credit. She waved her manicured hands at the camera, gushing to her followers about how her family was entering a new era of generational wealth. She talked about the upcoming merger gala as if it was the royal wedding, calling it the most exclusive high society event of the decade. She even had the audacity to drop hints about buying a new vacation home in the Hamptons. They were spending ghost money from a shadow company they knew absolutely nothing about. But the most pathetic display of false confidence came directly from my husband. Julian truly believed he had executed the perfect crime. Later that afternoon, I received a highly aggressive email from the senior partner at his cutthroat divorce law firm. The attorney gleefully informed me that his client had successfully secured the required legal funding and that they were moving forward with emergency petitions to freeze my corporate assets and seize control of my public relations agency. Julian had actually taken the forged credit authorization to a banker, wired the dummy funds to his lawyer, and convinced himself that he had completely outplayed me. He thought I was bleeding out, financially powerless to stop his legal assault. He did not realize I had intentionally let the wire transfer clear specifically to guarantee that his charge was elevated to a federal offense. I was sitting at my desk reviewing the final logistical details for the hostile takeover when my intercom buzzed. My assistant informed me that a private courier had arrived in the lobby with a secure package requiring my direct signature. I walked out and signed the digital pad, receiving a heavy black velvet envelope sealed with a thick stamp of gold wax. I took the envelope back into my office, sat behind my mahogany desk, and broke the seal. I pulled out a ridiculously lavish invitation. The cardstock was incredibly thick, edged in genuine gold leaf, and heavily embossed with the newly designed combined logo of Elias Commercial Real Estate Empire and Apex Investment Group. They had actually spent money they did not have to hire a branding agency to design a logo for a company they were about to permanently lose. The invitation formally requested my presence at the Grand Ballroom of the Grand Plaza Hotel for a celebratory press conference and VIP gala. Tucked carefully behind the formal invitation was a smaller piece of customized personal stationery. I immediately recognized Julian's messy, hurried handwriting. He had taken the time to write me a special message just to make sure I felt the full weight of his perceived victory. The note read, "Come watch us, become untouchable. Try not to cry." I traced my finger over the dark blue ink. Julian was feeling incredibly bold this week. He thought this invitation was the ultimate power move, rubbing his family's triumphant victory right in my face. He wanted me to sit in the back row of the audience and watch him ascend to the absolute peak of Atlanta high society. He wanted to look down at me from the stage and watch me break. I dropped the handwritten note into the sleek metal trash can next to my desk. A queen never rejects an invitation to claim her new kingdom. I placed the gold leaf card inside my leather purse and stood up from my desk. I had a very important appointment. If I was going to walk into a grand ballroom filled with the city elite, the financial press, and local politicians and publicly strip the most arrogant family in the state of everything they owned, I was not going to do it in a standard black business suit. I needed armor. I drove my car directly to my favorite luxury designer boutique in the upscale Buckhead shopping district. The owner recognized me immediately and locked the front doors, closing the store to the public so I could shop in complete privacy. She began pulling out racks of exclusive European runway pieces, offering me champagne and sparkling water. I bypassed the safe, elegant black dresses and the subdued navy gowns. I did not want to blend in. I wanted to be the only thing anyone in that room could look at. My eyes landed on a stunning crimson silk piece hanging near the back of the showroom. It was a custom-tailored floor-length designer gown with a sharp asymmetrical neckline and a daring slit up the left thigh. It was breathtakingly aggressive. It was the color of absolute power. It was the color of the massive financial deficit Elias was desperately trying to hide from his investors. And quite frankly, it was the color of the metaphorical blood I was about to spill on that stage. I slipped into the oversized dressing room and put the gown on. The silk hugged my curves perfectly, draping elegantly down to the floor. When I stepped out and looked at myself in the massive three-way mirror, the woman staring back at me was completely unrecognizable from the quiet, supportive wife who had walked into the country club just a week ago. That timid woman who bit her tongue to keep the peace was dead and buried. The woman standing in the mirror was a titan. She was the sole owner of a massive public relations firm, the majority shareholder of the city's most exclusive botanical gardens, and the primary proxy director of a multi-billion-dollar private equity shadow corporation. I purchased the dress immediately without even bothering to look at the exorbitant price tag. I also bought a pair of matching designer stilettos that felt sharp enough to step right through Julian's fragile ego. I walked back to my car, carefully hung the crimson gown in the back seat to prevent any wrinkles, and sat down behind the leather steering wheel. I pulled my phone out of my purse and opened the highly encrypted messaging application I used to communicate directly with my father. I did not need to type out a long strategic paragraph explaining my movements. He already knew the entire board was set. He knew the media was watching, and he knew Elias was standing blindly on the trapdoor, waiting for the lever to be pulled. I typed a single word and hit send. Checkmate. The grand ballroom of the Grand Plaza Hotel was a masterclass in excessive wealth. When I stepped out of my vehicle and handed the keys to the valet, the flashing bulbs of the local financial press were already illuminating the heavy stone entrance. I walked through the massive glass doors, and the low murmur of high society chatter immediately washed over me. The room was decorated in opulent gold and stark white, with towering crystal champagne pyramids strategically placed around the venue. It was a room designed to make ordinary people feel incredibly small. But tonight, I was not ordinary. I walked across the plush carpet in my custom crimson silk gown, and the effect was instantaneous. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Heads turned. Women in their safe, elegant black dresses stared in a mixture of shock and sheer envy. I did not look like a defeated woman on the verge of losing her business. I did not look like a heartbroken wife whose husband had publicly discarded her. I looked like absolute fire cutting through a room full of ice. I ignored the whispers and the pointing fingers, walking straight up to the front row of the audience seating area. The chairs were lined up facing a massive raised stage adorned with velvet ropes and expensive floral arrangements. The digital backdrop behind the podium proudly displayed the newly combined logo of the Elias Commercial Real Estate Empire and Apex Investment Group in massive glowing letters. I took my seat in the direct center of the front row, right in the crosshairs of the podium. I crossed my legs, rested my hands in my lap, and waited for the show to begin. A few minutes later, the heavy crystal chandeliers dimmed, and a hush fell over the crowd. A live string orchestra began playing a triumphant classical piece from the corner of the room. The heavy velvet curtains at the side of the stage parted, and the Golden family made their grand entrance. Elias walked out first, chest puffed out, looking like a conquering emperor returning from war. He was wearing a custom-tailored tuxedo that probably cost more than a luxury car. Right behind him came Terrence and Chloe. Chloe was practically glowing with manufactured arrogance, wearing a massive diamond necklace that caught the stage lights and sparkled aggressively. She looked out at the sea of wealthy guests with a smug, satisfied smile, fully believing she had finally secured her spot at the very top of the social hierarchy. Then came Julian. My husband stepped out onto the stage, fixing the cuffs of his crisp white shirt. He scanned the audience, and his eyes immediately locked onto my crimson dress in the front row. A wide, sickeningly arrogant smirk spread across his face. He nudged Terence and pointed discreetly down at me. They both chuckled. Julian truly believed I was sitting there in absolute defeat. He thought I had come to witness his glorious victory because his forged bank document had drained my resources and left me with no other choice but to surrender. He thought I was there to beg for mercy. I kept my face completely blank and offered him a slow, chilling smile. His smirk faltered for just a fraction of a second before he turned away. Elias stepped up to the heavy mahogany podium and tapped the microphone. The orchestra faded out, and the financial reporters in the back of the room raised their cameras. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, and esteemed members of the press. Elias began, his voice booming through the state-of-the-art sound system. We are gathered here tonight to celebrate a historic milestone. For decades, my family has built a legacy of excellence in this city. We have weathered economic storms, and we have consistently proven that vision and superior pedigree will always prevail in the marketplace. He paused, soaking in the polite applause from the audience. He gripped the edges of the podium, leaning forward, his eyes sweeping across the crowd before landing directly on me. His expression hardened, and his tone dropped into a low, condescending growl. But building a legacy is not just about making brilliant investments, Elias continued, his voice echoing in the quiet room. It is about protecting your empire from parasites. We all know the type of people I am talking about. People who come from nothing, who have no inherent value or class, and who try to attach themselves to great men. They try to drain your resources, and when they fail, they try to drag you down out of pure, bitter jealousy. They want to destroy what they could never build themselves. The room grew uncomfortably silent. Every single person in the front rows knew exactly who he was talking about. Chloe covered her mouth to hide a vicious giggle. Julian stared down at me, crossing his arms over his chest, radiating pure, absolute triumph. Elias was using his biggest public moment to execute one final, humiliating strike against me. But the strong always survive, Elias declared, raising his voice to a triumphant shout. And tonight we prove that we are untouchable. I want to publicly thank the brilliant anonymous visionaries at Apex Investment Group for recognizing the unparalleled value of my empire. Together, we are about to finalize a merger that will completely dominate the real estate landscape of this state for the next century. Elias turned to his right, where an executive assistant was holding a thick leather binder resting on a silver tray. The final contracts. The documents that would officially transfer his massive mountain of toxic debt over to my shadow corporation in exchange for absolute ownership of his entire life. Elias pulled a heavy gold fountain pen from his breast pocket. He opened the binder and dramatically positioned the pen over the signature line. The financial photographers raised their cameras, ready to capture the historic moment. The orchestra conductor raised his baton, preparing to cue the celebratory music the exact second the ink touched the paper. But Elias never got to sign his name. Before the gold tip of his pen could make contact with the contract, the atmosphere in the grand ballroom violently shifted. A loud, echoing crash ripped through the venue. The massive wooden double doors at the very back of the ballroom did not just open. They were forcefully shoved apart, hitting the interior walls with a heavy, violent thud that shook the floorboards. The orchestra conductor dropped his baton in shock. The music cut out instantly, leaving a dead, suffocating silence in its wake. The reporters lowered their cameras, turning around in mass confusion. Up on the stage, the triumphant smile completely vanished from Elias' face. Julian dropped his arms, stepping back from the edge of the stage. Near the entrance, the hotel security team scrambled frantically. Guards were shouting rapidly into their shoulder radios, completely overwhelmed and physically pushed aside. They were trying to stop a force that could not be stopped. I did not turn around to look. I did not need to. I kept my eyes locked perfectly on the stage, watching the absolute terror begin to wash over my husband's face as the reality of his nightmare finally walked through the door. The massive wooden doors of the ballroom did not just swing open. They were forcefully shoved apart, hitting the interior walls with a heavy, violent thud that physically shook the floorboards. The hotel security detail stationed near the entrance immediately scrambled, reaching for their radios to intercept the intruders. But they froze the second they saw who was stepping across the threshold. The men entering the room were not protesters or disgruntled investors. They were a highly coordinated private security team wearing discreet lapel pins that commanded absolute compliance. The hotel guards immediately stepped back, lowering their heads in deference and clearing the entryway. Through the parted doors walked Jeremiah Richards, my father. He moved into the opulent gold and white ballroom with the terrifying grace of an apex predator stepping into a cage full of completely defenseless birds. Behind him marched a phalanx of 6 senior corporate attorneys, all wearing impeccably tailored dark suits and carrying heavy titanium briefcases. Those briefcases held the final unredacted acquisition contracts, the undeniable proof of Elias' completely ruined financial state, and the absolute end of the Golden family. The live string orchestra conductor had dropped his baton in sheer shock, cutting the triumphant classical music instantly. In the suffocating silence that followed, the air was entirely sucked out of the room. The low murmur of high society chatter evaporated into sharp collective intakes of breath from the wealthy socialites sitting behind me. I could hear the frantic hushed whispers sweeping through the crowd like a wildfire. Jeremiah Richards. They were whispering his name with a mixture of absolute reverence and deep, visceral terror. To the people in this room, he was not just a billionaire. He was a living, breathing legend of black wealth. He was an absolute titan who had spent the last 30 years ruthlessly dismantling old money monopolies and swallowing generational empires for pure sport. He was a man who bankrupted corrupt politicians, hostile takeover specialists, and arrogant corporate elites before he even finished his morning coffee. To see him in person at a public event was incredibly rare. To see him walking into your press conference unannounced, flanked by a literal army of litigators, meant your company was already dead, and you were just waiting for the coroner to sign the paperwork. The wealthy men in the audience who regularly bragged about their massive trust funds and elite political connections actively shrank back into their chairs. They lowered their eyes, trying desperately to avoid making accidental eye contact with the titan. They knew that a single focused glance from Jeremiah Richards could result in a devastating audit of their own companies by the following morning. But Elias was completely blinded by his own towering arrogance and desperate greed. He did not see a predator coming to execute a kill on the ballroom floor. He saw the ultimate public validation of his entire pathetic existence. Elias knew that Apex Investment Group was backed by massive dark money, but the proxy managers had never given him a specific name. Now seeing the legendary Jeremiah Richards walking down the center aisle of his press conference, Elias connected all the wrong dots. He suddenly believed that this terrifying billionaire was the secret primary benefactor of Apex, and that Richards had come to personally bless this historic merger in front of the press. The delusion was so absolute, it was almost painful to watch. The triumphant smile returned to Elias' face, stretching so wide it looked unhinged. He threw his heavy gold fountain pen down onto the mahogany podium and practically sprinted to the edge of the velvet-lined stage. He shoved past a local news cameraman, nearly knocking the poor man off the platform in his haste. Julian, however, was not smiling. Julian hovered near the podium, looking completely lost. I watched my husband's face as a look of mounting dread began to creep into his eyes. He looked at the titan walking down the aisle, and then he looked down at me sitting completely unbothered in my crimson silk gown. Julian was arrogant, but he was not entirely stupid. He could feel the atmospheric pressure in the room dropping, and his survival instincts were finally starting to scream at him. But Elias was completely deaf to the warning signs. His chest was puffed out and he was practically vibrating with sycophantic excitement. He thought he was about to shake hands with a legend and permanently elevate his family into the stratosphere of global wealth. He thought he had finally won the ultimate game. My father did not rush. He walked down the center aisle of the grand ballroom with a slow, deliberate, and punishingly steady cadence. Every step of his polished leather shoes echoed sharply against the marble floor sections. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit that radiated quiet, absolute power. His expression was carved from solid stone. He did not look at the glittering crystal chandeliers or the expensive towering floral arrangements. He kept his dark, piercing eyes locked straight ahead, completely ignoring the hundreds of flashing camera bulbs exploding around him. Elias reached the very edge of the stage stairs, leaning aggressively over the velvet rope. He eagerly thrust his right hand out his palm, practically sweating with anticipation. "Mr. Richards!" Elias shouted, his voice echoing through the silent room, cracking slightly with desperate excitement. "What an absolute honor, sir! We are beyond thrilled to welcome you to this historic celebration. I am Elias, your new partner in this magnificent endeavor. Thank you for coming down here to personally finalize our monumental agreement." The financial photographers rushed forward, their camera flashes exploding like strobe lights, desperate to capture the historic handshake. They wanted the cover photo of the old money real estate patriarch joining forces with the legendary billionaire titan. Up on the stage, Chloe stood up from her chair, practically bouncing on her heels, already calculating how many new brand deals and social media followers this massive connection would buy her. My father reached the front of the stage. Elias leaned further down, stretching his body, his hand extended as far as his arm would physically allow. But Jeremiah did not slow his pace. He did not reach his hand out to meet the patriarch. He did not even blink. My father completely ignored the extended hand, acting as if the man speaking to him did not even exist. He left Elias suspended in mid-air, looking like an absolute fool in front of the entire financial press and the city elite. The billionaire titan stepped right past the stage, bypassing the podium and the groveling patriarch entirely. He turned his broad shoulders and walked directly toward the center of the front row. He walked straight toward the woman in the crimson silk gown. My father stopped directly in front of my chair. The absolute silence in the grand ballroom was heavy enough to crush bone. Hundreds of eyes darted frantically between the legendary billionaire titan and the woman in the crimson dress they had all been whispering about just minutes prior. The room collectively held its breath, waiting for the titan to speak. I did not stand up immediately. I looked up into my father's dark, piercing eyes. For the first time all evening, his rigid, terrifying expression completely softened. He reached out and gently placed his large hand on my shoulder. He leaned down slowly and pressed a warm, fatherly kiss to my forehead. When he pulled back, he looked at me with an overwhelming sense of pride that he made sure the entire room could witness. "You look absolutely beautiful, sweetheart," my father said, his deep, resonant voice carrying effortlessly through the dead, silent ballroom. "Just like your mother." The physical reactions from the stage were immediate and incredibly violent. A sharp crystalline crash echoed through the room. Julian had dropped his expensive champagne flute. It shattered into 100 pieces across the polished wooden floorboards of the stage, spilling vintage wine everywhere. My husband was staring at me, his mouth hanging open, his face drained of every single drop of blood. He looked like a man who had just watched the ground open up beneath his feet. He took a stumbling step backward, shaking his head in absolute denial. At the podium, Elias looked as if he had been physically struck by a freight train. Both of his hands clamped down onto the edges of the mahogany stand, his knuckles turning completely white. His jaw worked silently, trying to form words that his brain simply could not process. The billionaire he had just tried to grovel to, the man he thought was his financial savior, had just kissed the forehead of the woman he had publicly called a parasite not 5 minutes ago. The color completely vanished from Elias' face, leaving him looking pale and sickly under the bright stage lights. Behind him, Chloe was having a complete mental breakdown. She grabbed Terrence by his suit jacket, practically digging her manicured nails into his arm. The smug, confident influencer persona was entirely gone, replaced by sheer, unfiltered panic. But her last name is Washington. Chloe violently whispered to Terence, her voice carrying sharply in the quiet room. This is impossible. She is an orphan. She grew up in poverty. How can she be his daughter? Terence could not even form a response. He was staring at my father with wide, terrified eyes, finally realizing the catastrophic magnitude of the mistake his family had made. The wealthy socialites in the audience began to violently whisper among themselves. The financial press reporters who had lowered their cameras were now scrambling to turn them back on, realizing they were not just covering a standard corporate merger. They were witnessing a legendary high society execution. The flashbulbs started firing again, illuminating the sheer panic radiating from the Golden family on stage. Elias shook his head desperately, refusing to accept the reality unfolding right in front of him. No, he stammered, his booming voice now reduced to a pathetic, high-pitched wheeze. No, this is a mistake. Mr. Richards, you do not understand. That woman is a manipulator. She is trying to ruin this historic merger between our families. My father did not even turn around to look at Elias. He kept his eyes focused entirely on me, a slight, dangerous smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He was giving me the floor. He was letting me strike the final blow. I reached down and grabbed my matching crimson clutch. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the absolute sheer power of the moment surge through my veins. The days of biting my tongue to keep the peace were over. The days of letting arrogant men dictate my worth were permanently finished. I stood up gracefully from my chair, standing shoulder to shoulder with the most feared man in the financial world. Every camera lens in the room pivoted away from the disgraced patriarch and focused entirely on me. The flashing lights reflected off the silk of my crimson gown, making it look as though I were standing in a pillar of fire. I looked directly up at the stage, locking eyes with my terrified husband, and then shifting my cold gaze to my crumbling father-in-law. Washington was my mother's maiden name. I said, my voice crystal clear, projecting flawlessly across the massive ballroom, cutting through the frantic whispers of the crowd. I dropped my father's famous last name 10 years ago because I wanted to build my own empire without his shadow. And when I met you, Julian, I kept my real identity a secret. I took a deliberate step forward, moving closer to the edge of the stage, closing the distance between myself and the men who had abused me. I wanted to see exactly who you people really were when you thought I had absolutely nothing. I continued, my tone dropping into a cold, lethal register that echoed through the silence. And you showed me. You showed me at the country club. You showed me when you locked me out of my own home. You showed me when you tried to bankrupt my business. And you showed me just now, Elias, when you stood on that stage and called me a parasite. The silence that followed my words was deafening. There was no applause, no laughter, just the raw electric tension of an empire collapsing in real time. I watched the realization wash over Julian's face. He finally understood that the woman he had slapped, the woman he had constantly belittled to make himself feel powerful, was actually the heir to an unfathomable fortune. He had possessed the winning lottery ticket, and he had set it on fire just to warm his own fragile ego. Chloe backed away from Terence, her hands trembling as she looked at me in pure horror. She suddenly realized that the woman she had publicly branded as ghetto on the internet was the literal royalty she had been desperately pretending to be. Her luxury sports car, her planned vacations, her entire influencer aesthetic was funded by ghost money from a company that I currently controlled. I stood tall in my crimson gown, refusing to break eye contact with Elias. He was gripping the podium so hard, I thought the thick wood might actually snap in his hands. He was trapped. He could not yell at me. He could not order security to remove me. I was completely untouchable, and I was about to take everything he had ever claimed to own right in front of the entire city. I did not wait for Elias to formulate another pathetic excuse or for Julian to recover from his initial shock. I lifted the hem of my crimson silk gown and walked deliberately toward the short flight of stairs leading up to the massive stage. My designer stilettos clicked sharply against the polished wooden steps, and with every single step, The heavy, suffocating silence in the ballroom seemed to magnify. The wealthy socialites who had mocked me, the corporate elites who had dismissed me, and the financial reporters who were hungry for a scandal all watched in absolute awe as I ascended to the platform. As I stepped onto the main stage, Julian physically recoiled. The arrogant, confident man who had slapped me across the face at the country club was completely gone. He stumbled backward, bumping into a massive crystal champagne pyramid. A few glasses wobbled precariously, but did not fall. His eyes were wide with a terror so pure it almost looked childish. He raised his hands slightly defensively, as if he expected me to strike him exactly the way he had struck me. He was completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his own mistake. But I did not even look at him. He was merely a pawn, and I was there to execute the king. I walked directly up to the heavy mahogany podium. Elias was still gripping the edges of the wooden stand, his chest heaving, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. Sweat was pouring down his forehead, ruining his perfectly styled hair and soaking the collar of his expensive tuxedo. He looked completely broken. He was an old, arrogant man who had finally met a predator he could not intimidate or buy off. I reached out and wrapped my fingers around the metal stem of the microphone. For a split second, Elias tried to hold on to it. His knuckles turned white as he desperately tried to maintain his grip on the podium and the microphone simultaneously. It was a pathetic final grasp at the absolute power he was losing. I gave him a cold, dead stare, looking right through his desperate facade. "Let it go, Elias," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, but dripping with lethal authority. He swallowed hard, his throat clicking audibly, and he let go. He collapsed back a step, practically falling into the chair behind him. I pulled the microphone from the stand and turned to face the massive audience. The ballroom was completely electrified. The financial reporters were practically hanging off the edge of the velvet ropes, their digital recorders thrust forward, and their cameras ready. Down in the front row, my father, Jeremiah Richards, stood with his arms crossed, watching me with a look of profound, absolute pride. He had built his empire by destroying corrupt men, and now he was watching his daughter do the exact same thing on the grandest stage in the city. "Good evening, everyone," I said, my voice steady and commanding, effortlessly filling the massive room. "My name is Kendra Richards Washington, and there is a slight but incredibly vital correction that needs to be made regarding tonight's historic announcement." I paced slowly across the stage, the crimson silk of my gown flowing behind me like liquid fire. Elias has spent the entire week going on local television and bragging to the press about a massive financial bailout from a mysterious entity known as Apex Investment Group. He told all of you that they chose him because of his brilliant business acumen and his family's unparalleled legacy in the real estate market. He told you that this merger would make his empire completely untouchable. I paused, letting the weight of my words hang in the air. I turned to the terrified executive assistant, who was still standing rigidly on the side of the stage, holding a silver tray with a thick leather binder. I gestured for him to bring it to me. The young man scrambled forward, practically bowing, as he handed me the heavy binder containing the final merger documents. I opened it, holding it up high so the bright camera flashes could capture the official legal text and the gold-embossed seals. Apex Investment Group is not a group of anonymous Wall Street visionaries, I announced, projecting my voice so it bounced off the crystal chandeliers and reached the very back walls. Apex Investment Group is a private equity holding company entirely owned and operated by the Richards family, and I am the primary proxy director holding sole signing authority over this entire portfolio. A fresh wave of shocked gasps ripped through the audience. The camera flashes intensified, becoming blindingly bright, as the press realized they were documenting the greatest corporate ambush in Atlanta history. Behind me, Chloe let out a quiet, high-pitched whimper, burying her face in her hands as her entire manufactured reality dissolved into dust. Terrence dropped his head between his knees, looking physically sick. I turned my body slightly so I was addressing both the eager crowd and the disgraced patriarch sitting in the shadows of the stage. You see, Elias did not tell his investors or the press the actual truth about why he needed this historic deal, I said, dropping my tone into a cold, clinical register. He is currently drowning in $80 million of toxic corporate debt. He has been systematically commingling investor funds, taking out illegal bridge loans, and desperately trying to hide catastrophic retail losses. The wealthy investors in the audience who had trusted Elias with their money began shouting in outrage. Security had to step forward to keep them from rushing the stage. I held up my hand calling for silence, and the room immediately obeyed. Right now, Elias is facing a massive federal fraud indictment. I continued, sealing his fate completely. He was begging my family for pocket change just to stay out of a federal prison cell. He thought Apex Investment Group was going to blindly hand him $40 million to save his fragile ego and maintain his country club lifestyle. I walked over to where Elias was sitting. He could not even look up at me. He was staring blankly at the floor, his entire empire crumbling around him in real time. I tossed the heavy leather binder onto the podium, where it landed with a loud, definitive thud. "We are not bailing you out, Elias," I said, delivering the final blow with absolute surgical precision. "We are acquiring your debt for pennies on the dollar. As of this exact second, I own your commercial real estate company. I own your luxury assets. I own your properties, and I own your pathetic legacy. And to be absolutely clear, you and your entire family are fired." The ballroom exploded. It was as if someone had thrown a live grenade into a glass house. The financial reporters completely abandoned their designated press area, surging forward against the velvet ropes. They were shouting questions over each other, shoving their digital recorders toward the stage, desperate to get a quote from the new owner of the Elias real estate empire. The wealthy investors who had been duped were screaming furiously, demanding their money back. Elias collapsed into the mahogany chair behind the podium. He clutched his chest, his breathing reduced to ragged, shallow wheezes. The towering, invincible patriarch was gone, replaced by a broken old man who had just watched his entire life work evaporate into my spare change. He looked out at the angry mob of investors, realizing that without my shadow corporation bailing him out, he was going to face federal prison time completely alone. But Julian was not ready to surrender. My husband had always possessed a terrifying level of delusion, and tonight he proved that his arrogance knew absolutely no bounds. He watched his father crumble and realized his inheritance was dead. So he pivoted. He turned his desperate, greedy eyes back to me. Julian took a step forward, his hands raised in a placating gesture. He tried to plaster on the charming smile he used to manipulate me for 5 years, but it looked sickly and unhinged. "Kendra, wait," he said, his voice trembling but laced with a desperate kind of entitlement. "Let us just calm down and talk about this privately. You are upset, and I understand that. I made mistakes, but we are still legally married. We are still husband and wife. You built this empire, and that is incredible, but under state law, what is yours is mine. We can run this new company together. We do not have to throw it all away." I stared at him, feeling a wave of absolute disgust wash over me. He had slapped me, humiliated me in front of his elite friends, and served me with divorce papers demanding alimony and my business. But the second he realized I was a billionaire, he was ready to play the loving, devoted husband again, just to get his hands on my wealth. "Julian, you served me with expedited divorce papers 3 days ago," I said, my voice projecting clearly through the microphone so the entire room could hear his hypocrisy. "You demanded 70% of my public relations firm and permanent spousal support. I know, and I will tear them up," Julian pleaded, taking another step closer. "I will call my lawyer right now and cancel the filing. We can fix our marriage, Kendra. You are my wife. I am entitled to share in your success. You cannot just cut me out completely." I let out a sharp, humorless laugh that echoed through the sound system. "You really think you have outsmarted me, Julian? You think you secured the funding to ruin my life, And now you want to hit the undo button because the trap snapped shut on your own leg. I stepped away from the podium and walked to the center of the stage. I looked past the flashing cameras and made direct eye contact with the hotel audiovisual technician standing in the control booth at the back of the room. I gave him a single sharp nod and snapped my fingers. The massive digital projector screen behind me abruptly flickered. The glowing gold logo of the Elias real estate empire vanished completely, plunging the stage into momentary darkness. A second later, the screen illuminated with crystal-clear, ultra-high-definition video footage. It was the hidden camera feed from my old home office. The entire ballroom went dead silent again, as the massive screen broadcasted Julian's desperate, sweaty face. The hidden microphone audio pumped through the grand ballroom speakers echoing off the vaulted ceilings. Every single person in the room watched in absolute horror as Julian aggressively searched my office, found the dummy corporate credit authorization, and called his aggressive divorce attorney. They heard him explicitly state his intention to steal $250,000 to fund his legal war against me, to take my house and leave me with nothing. And then the grand finale played. The camera zoomed in, perfectly capturing the exact moment Julian picked up my silver fountain pen and deliberately forged my signature on a federally insured bank document. The video did not just play once. The technician had set it on a continuous loop. Every time Julian signed the forged document, the video restarted, showing his sweaty, desperate face calling his lawyer all over again. The undeniable proof of his felony was being broadcasted on a 20-foot screen directly behind him for the entire financial press to record. "Turn it off!" Julian screamed, his voice cracking in sheer panic. He spun around, waving his arms frantically at the massive screen, as if he could physically wipe the image away. "Turn that off right now! It is a fake! She set me up! That is illegally recorded!" He looked frantically out at the audience, but there was no sympathy left in the room. The socialites who had laughed at his cruel jokes were now staring at him with pure disgust. The reporters were zooming in on the screen, ensuring they captured every single frame of the forgery. "Julian," I said, my voice cutting through his hysterical shouting. "You broke into my property and signed a fraudulent financial document to secure a $250,000 line of credit from a federally insured bank. You then wired those stolen funds across state lines to your attorney. That is not just a marital dispute, Julian. That is aggravated identity theft and felony wire fraud." Before Julian could scream another denial, heavy footsteps echoed up the wooden stairs on the right side of the stage. Two tall, broad-shouldered men wearing plainclothes suits and serious expressions walked onto the platform. They were not hotel security. They were detectives from the Atlanta Police Department Financial Crimes Division, and they had been waiting in the wings for my exact signal. They walked directly past Elias and flanked Julian on both sides. Julian froze, his eyes darting between the two detectives like a trapped animal. Julian Elias, the lead detective, said, his voice firm and completely devoid of emotion. "You are under arrest for felony wire fraud, forgery, and aggravated identity theft. Place your hands behind your back." "No." Julian whimpered, instinctively pulling his arms away. "No, you cannot do this. I am a wealthy man. I belong to the Oak Ridge Country Club. You cannot just arrest me in front of all these people." The second detective did not hesitate. He grabbed Julian's arm, twisted it firmly behind his back, and secured a heavy pair of steel handcuffs around his wrists. The sharp metallic click of the locking mechanism echoed through the microphone I was still holding, amplifying his absolute downfall. "You have the right to remain silent," the lead detective stated loudly, reading Julian, his Miranda rights on live television as the press cameras snapped rapidly. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney." Julian began to cry. Real heavy tears of absolute terror streamed down his face, ruining his arrogant facade completely. He was not going back to his luxury townhouse. He was not moving into my master bedroom. He was going to a concrete holding cell. As the detectives turned him around to march him off the stage, Julian desperately looked for a lifeline. He looked toward his family. Chloe was already running for the service exit, leaving Terrence behind. Terrence was staring at the floor, completely paralyzed by the destruction of his family. Finally, Julian looked at the man who had taught him everything about entitlement and arrogance. He looked at his father. Julian sobbed, struggling against the detective's grip. "Dad, please do something. Call your lawyers. Pay my bail. Do not let them take me like this. Please, Dad, help me." Elias slowly pushed himself up from his chair. He looked at his golden boy, his perfect son, who was now crying in handcuffs on a public stage. Elias looked at the massive projector screen, still looping the forgery video. Then he looked at the angry mob of investors waiting for him in the audience. Elias realized that associating with his felon's son would only destroy whatever microscopic shred of credibility he had left for his own upcoming federal trial. Elias adjusted his suit jacket, turned his head away, and deliberately presented his back to Julian. He did not say a single word. He completely abandoned his son to save himself. The heavy wooden doors closed behind the detectives, taking Julian away, and the reality of the situation finally shattered the last remaining illusions in the room. Chloe watched her brother-in-law get dragged out in handcuffs and realized her luxurious lifestyle had just evaporated. The designer clothes, the country club memberships, and the expensive leased cars were all gone. She turned and looked at Terrence, who was still staring blankly at his father in complete shock. Chloe realized in an instant that tying herself to a sinking ship was social suicide. So she did what she always did. She tried to play the innocent victim. Chloe scrambled up the stage stairs, her pink floral dress catching on the velvet ropes. She rushed toward me, her face already contorted into a mask of pure terror and desperation. The tears began flowing instantly. It was the exact same theatrical performance she had used for her Instagram followers and the responding police officers, but this time she was directing it entirely at me. "Kendra, please," Chloe sobbed, reaching out to grab my hands. I stepped back, letting her grasp at empty air. I looked down at her with absolute disgust. "Please, you have to believe me," Chloe cried, her voice cracking perfectly. I did not know what they were doing. "Julian and Terrence manipulated me. They lied to me about your business and your finances. I always told Terrence that we should be kinder to you, but they would not listen. We are sisters, Kendra. You cannot let them ruin my life too. I will do anything. I will publicly apologize on my platform. Just please do not take everything away from us." I looked at the trembling, weeping woman kneeling on the stage in front of me. This was the same woman who had laughed out loud when my husband slapped me. The same woman who had tried to have me thrown out of the botanical gardens like common trash. "Save the tears, Chloe," I said, my voice perfectly flat and devoid of a single ounce of pity. "They do not work on me. You built your entire identity on stepping on people you thought were beneath you. Now you get to find out exactly what it feels like to be at the bottom." Chloe let out a pathetic whimper, shrinking back from my cold stare. "Oh, and Chloe," I added, leaning in slightly, so only she could hear me over the chaotic shouting of the press. "About that master bedroom you were so eager to move into, you might want to cancel your interior decorator. I am having a demolition crew bulldoze the entire townhouse next Tuesday. Have fun packing whatever cheap luggage you have left." Chloe collapsed onto her knees, burying her face in her hands, sobbing genuinely for the very first time in her life. I turned my back on the ruined family. I walked down the stage stairs and my father met me at the bottom. He offered me his arm and I took it. Together we walked down the center aisle of the grand ballroom. The sea of reporters parted for us, the rapid camera flashes illuminating our triumphant exit. We walked out the heavy glass doors, leaving Elias, Julian, Terrence, and Chloe choking on the ashes of the empire they had burned to the ground. 6 months later, the warm morning sun poured through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my penthouse office. I sat behind a massive slab of imported black marble that served as my desk, looking out over the sprawling Atlanta skyline. The city looked entirely different from up here. It looked smaller, manageable, and completely mine. The gold lettering on the double doors of my executive suite proudly read, "Richards Washington Media." The merger between my boutique public relations agency and my father's global holding firm had been finalized, making me one of the most powerful corporate executives in the Southeast. I took a slow sip of my black espresso and signed the final page of a lucrative new acquisition contract. On the far wall, a sleek flat-screen television was playing the local morning financial news on a low volume. I did not usually pay attention to the morning broadcasts, but today was a special occasion. The anchor was delivering a follow-up report on the greatest corporate scandal of the year. According to the broadcast, the federal judge had completely rejected Julian's plea deal because he had transferred the stolen funds across state lines to his aggressive divorce attorney. The wire fraud charges carried maximum federal penalties. My former husband was officially sentenced to 3 years in a federal penitentiary with no possibility of early parole. He had cried openly in the courtroom, begging the judge for mercy, but his elite connections could no longer save him. Elias did not fare much better. The federal fraud investigation into his commercial real estate empire had completely bankrupted him. Stripped of his company and his assets by my hostile takeover, Elias was forced to file for personal bankruptcy to avoid joining his son in federal prison. The mighty patriarch who used to terrorize country club waiters and lecture people on superiority was now living in a tiny rented studio apartment on the outskirts of the city, permanently banned from every high society circle he once ruled. As for the golden couple, they did not survive the financial drought. The second the credit cards started declining and the leased sports cars were repossessed, Chloe filed for an expedited divorce. She abandoned Terrence, fleeing back to her hometown in Savannah in complete disgrace, deleting her social media accounts to hide from the public mockery. Without his father's money or his wife's curated influence, Terrence was forced to take a mid-level entry job at a logistics company working under managers he would have previously mocked. They had all received exactly what they deserved. I muted the television and set my silver fountain pen down on the polished marble desk. I stood up, smoothing the front of my tailored emerald green suit, and walked over to the massive glass windows. I looked down at the bustling streets, the tiny cars, and the microscopic people moving through their daily lives. I thought about the woman I was 5 years ago. The quiet, desperate woman who just wanted a family to accept her. The woman who bit her tongue and swallowed her pride to protect the fragile egos of arrogant men. That woman was completely gone, replaced by a titan who commanded respect and destroyed anyone who dared to disrespect her. The journey had been painful, but it was absolutely necessary. Every insult, every microaggression, and every single betrayal had merely forged me into an unbreakable weapon. I smiled, feeling the warm sunlight on my face, taking a deep breath of the quiet, peaceful air in my high-rise office. They thought they were the kings and queens of the city. They thought I was just a pawn they could knock off the board and discard whenever they pleased. They thought they could put me in my place. They just did not realize my place was on the throne. The greatest lesson here is that you must never shrink yourself to fit into rooms where you are not valued. Kendra's journey proves that true power does not come from seeking validation from toxic people who are committed to misunderstanding you. It comes from silently building your own empire, knowing your actual worth, and waiting for the right moment to reclaim your space. When arrogant people show you exactly who they are, believe them immediately. Do not waste tears on those who mock your struggles. Instead, use their underestimation as fuel to construct a reality where you hold every single card. If you have ever had to walk away from a toxic environment to build your own throne, hit the like button and subscribe for more stories of absolute triumph.